Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Gabrielle Lawson, the chair of the Adult Christian Formation Committee. I think I know almost everyone in the room today, so good morning. We are talking about Job today, and as David just joked, everyone wants to be out there enjoying their friends and company and not talking about suffering. But I am sure that Barry will lead us through a wonderful, reflective, and hopefully hopeful discussion about what the meaning of Job is today. As you know, we're traveling through the Old Testament this fall, and there are handouts by the front door. There's also a sign up for the email list, so if you want to get reminders of what we talked about, links to the materials and to the video or audio recording, that's available for you all as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Barry Sherbeck. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. If you didn't get one of the handout sheets, maybe someone can grab a couple extras. Or we're going to be doing a little bit of writing if things go well with our timing today later on, and so the back of that can be used for some journaling if you'd like to do that. So, the book of Job, very good things happen to people, very bad things happen to people. It's a book of questions. Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen? Is there a cause and effect? Is there a relationship that we can discern over time and in talking with God, in our communication with each other, in Scripture? Are there some things that we conclude or not? And maybe we'll find some of both of those answers. It is wisdom literature. We're going to take a look at a short video in a sec that we looked at some other pieces, and we looked in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and Job is part of that wisdom literature. It's a very different take. It is poetry, but it's a part of that series. And the book of Job is mostly conversations between friends, sometimes who seem like they're really good friends, sometimes who seem like they're not very good friends, between God and between people. And lots of questions. And some indirect answers. Sometimes non-answers. So let's watch this first video.
There are 3 books in the Bible known as the wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The first, Proverbs, showed us that God is wise and just.
Yeah, we learned that God has ordered the world so that it's fair. The righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. In other words, you get what you deserve.
But then we meet Ecclesiastes, who observes, people don't always get what they deserve.
Yeah, he said the world isn't always fair, that life is unpredictable and hard to comprehend, just like smoke.
And this makes you wonder, okay, well, is God wise and just?
Exactly. And so it's that question that is being explored in the final book of wisdom, Job.
All right, let's dive in.
So Job begins with a strange story that takes place up in the heavens, which are described something like a heavenly command center. So God is there with these angelic creatures called the sons of God, and they're all there reporting for duty.
And God points out this guy Job, his servant, showing how righteous and good he is.
And then one of these angelic creatures approaches. He's referred to in Hebrew as the Satan.
The Satan. Who is this?
Well, this word is actually a title, which literally means the one who is opposed. So out of this whole crew, he is the one questioning how God is running the world. And he proposes that Job might not actually love God, that he's only a good person because God rewards him. If God were to take away all of the good things he gave to Job, then we would see his true colors.
So he thinks Job is just working the system?
And that's exactly right. Maybe he's obeying just to get what he wants.
So God agrees to this experiment and allows the Satan to inflict something on Job.
And Job loses everyone and everything that he cares about. It is devastating. And remember, he deserves none of this. God himself said so.
The remarkable thing is that in the midst of all this suffering, Job still praises God.
At least for chapters 1 and 2. But then in chapter 3, we find out how he's really feeling inside. He unleashes this poem that reveals his devastation. It's a long, elaborate curse on the day that he was born.
After this, some of Job's friends come to visit him to offer their help. And all of them are like, Job, you must have done something horribly wrong to deserve this. After all, we know God is just, and we know the world is ordered by God's justice and fairness, so you must be getting what you deserve.
And for the next 34 chapters, the friends and Job go back and forth in very dense Hebrew poetry. His friends keep speculating about why God might have sent such suffering, and they even start making up lists of hypothetical sins that Job must have committed. But after each accusation, Job defends his innocence.
And Job is innocent.
He is. He's also on an emotional roller coaster. At some moments, he's very confident that God is still wise and just.
Yeah, in other moments, he's doubting God's goodness.
He even comes to accuse God of being reckless, unfair, and corrupt. So by the end of the dialogue, Job demands that God come and explain himself in person. And God does so. He comes in the form of a great storm cloud.
Now, God doesn't give Job a direct answer. He doesn't tell Job about the conversation with the Satan.
Yeah, he does something very different. He takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe. He shows Job how grand the world is, and he asks him if he's even capable of running it or understanding it, just for a day. He shows Job how much detail there is in the world, things that we might see every day, but really don't understand at all. But God does. He knows it all intimately. He pays attention to the beauty and operations of the universe in ways that we haven't even imagined and in places that we will never see.
Then to conclude, God shows Job two wondrous beasts and brags about how great they are.
Yeah, they are dangerous. I mean, they would kill you without even thinking about it. And God says they're not evil. They're actually a part of his good world.
And then that's it. That's God's whole defense. It's kind of weird. I mean, what was this all about?
It seems to be this. From Job's point of view, it looks like God is not just. But God's perspective is infinitely bigger. He's dynamically interacting with a whole universe of complexity when he makes decisions. And this is what God calls his wisdom.
So Job asking God to defend himself is actually kind of absurd.
He couldn't comprehend this kind of complexity even if he wanted to.
So where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves Job in a place of humility. He never learned why he suffered, and yet he's able to live in peace and in the fear of the Lord.
But that's not where the book ends, because after this, God restores to Job double everything he had promised. And this, again, is surprising. I mean, is this a reward? Is God saying, congratulations, Job, you passed this elaborate test?
No, I mean, the whole book just made the point that Job losing everything was not a punishment, and so not getting it back isn't a reward.
So why does he get it back?
Well, apparently, God, in his wisdom, decided to give Job a gift. We don't know why. But what we do know is that Job is now the kind of person who, no matter what comes, good or bad, he can trust God's wisdom.
And that's the book of Job, and the end of our wisdom series.
These biblical books of wisdom are amazing. Each one offers a unique perspective on the good life, and you need to hear all of them together as you learn to live with wisdom and in the fear of the Lord.
So that's a helpful comparison to the other wisdom books and some different angles on wisdom and understanding God and God's perspective on us and our creation that we live in. The book of Job itself, the time frame is unclear. It's not clear who the author is. The land of Uz is far away from Israel. Uz, however you want to say it. Uzites. Job is not an Israelite. In fact, all of the characters in the entire story are not Israelites. And there are more questions than there are answers throughout the book. Structurally, we're going to look at another video in a minute, but there's a prologue for 2 chapters. There's 35 or so chapters of conversation between Job and his friends. God responds for a few chapters and says, okay, I've been listening to your questions. Here's a response. Guess what he responds with? A lot of questions. And there's an epilogue. So that's the structure. The characters, there's God, there's the angels, there's the Satan, the one who is opposed, or sometimes there's a phrase used that he's an accuser. There's Job and his wife, Job's family and community, and his three friends. And there's a person named Elihu. So there's three friends: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. And this might be the only comic relief that we get today, because it's a heavy book. This is what my brain did when I was very young and I heard about Bildad the Shuhite. So, that's what came to mind. And he's the only guy I could remember his name. I couldn't remember the other two names. So, Job's three friends. So they hear of Job's suffering. They live a long ways away. So somehow, word travels, they get the emails, and they're like, Job is going through, he's not just sick or lost something, but he's like devastated. So they hear, they come from afar. What's fascinating is that they actually spend 7 days with him in silence. He's put on sackcloth and ashes, which is this ritual that people do when they're mourning or when they're repenting. And so they come and they do that with him. And they don't come and right away say, well, Job, let's talk about why this is happening. Like, they actually enter into his suffering with him. Then they do some accusing and blaming and trying to figure out what's going on here, what's the cause and effect, what can we know, what do we bring from our theological understanding that we think we have, how does it apply to the situation? Well, there must be some cause and effect. And we humans tend to often want to do that. Like, we do want answers, not just questions to our questions. We want answers to our questions. And there's interesting dialogue. One of the things, there's some funny sarcasm in some of the banter that goes back and forth. Job, after he listens for a while, says, oh, you are the only one who matters. You're the only people who matter, and wisdom, when you die, wisdom will die with you, So there's this sarcasm that his friends give to him, that he gives to them, that he gives to God in some cases, and God gives back to him. It's part of the dialogue. So let's look at a video that's an overview. These are similar to the other videos we've been watching. And this will give us the best idea of the actual content and conversation, since we don't have the time to get into the text ourselves, the structure of the whole book.
The Book of Job is a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The Book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament, describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man. And then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you blessed him with prosperity. Let Job suffer. Then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with the suffering and bewildered Job, who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by three friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how the section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend, then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just. The implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way. And so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of. Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind. And he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours is extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God. And what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now this is surprising, because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling. How Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored. Not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God. And that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God, and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
So it's a lot. 42 chapters, a lot of conversations, a lot of stuff that we have some kind of on-ramps to most of this ourselves in our personal lives with our own individual selves as well as people around us who have experienced suffering or are experiencing suffering. And we have variations of these kinds of questions. So it's not like it's some story about someone else's experience and I'm like, oh, I just want to try to learn about this. Like we actually have some ways to be in this story ourselves, right? Do we get what we deserve? For better or for worse, is it our blamelessness or our faulty living that is the cause for that? It's one of the main questions that comes up. Was Job actually sinless? It kind of says that in the book, but then there's evidence that Job wasn't sinless in his conversation with God. It's hard to know that exactly. It's an interesting question to ask. Was Job a real man? Was this a story that was told to illustrate truths, or was Job a real person? Because of the ambiguity about the book, we actually don't have like a historical time frame where we can cross-check with other records about individuals that we can do with other parts of the Old Testament. So we don't know the answer to that question, but it's okay to ask that question, right? Did these events all happen the way the story tells? Were they in some way rhetorical, symbolic? Some of it is rhetoric. It's conversation between friends. There's this sarcasm. There's these conclusions that people reach, and they actually contradict themselves later on when they're sort of expanding on it. They're just kind of thinking out loud, right? It's certainly a huge area of theological, it's not one theological question, but it's a whole bunch of them that are very intense and deep, and that we're all either currently or at some point in our lives going to have a pretty strong engagement with. They're genuine conversations and questions. And because of the nature of not knowing the author, the time frame, some of the real specifics, like we do with some other books in the Old Testament, it has kind of a timeless relevance. And in poetic form as well. So God, I love this question towards the end, the last couple chapters where God says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And he has all of these details about, do you know how long the doe is going to be pregnant before she has her fawn? And do you command the storms? And are you kind of in charge of the sunrise? So all these rhetorical, sarcastic questions to Job. But God actually listens for most of the book in the way this story is told, this narrative. And God can handle all of these questions, right? At the same time, there's kind of this implied thing, and God says this, who are you to question me? Are you righteous? And you're saying I'm the one that's sinful? So we do have to be careful not to refrain from asking God questions, but when we do that, we're often going to get questions back. Is God like a storm cloud? Is our faith in God and our trying to work that out, is it a safe process? Or maybe is it unsafe? Is unbelief any safer than the faith choices and things we try to work out to understand? It's really interesting to me that these two creatures are in this story, because they're unlike all of the rest of it, where these human beings who are friends are trying to, I think this is what's going on, and Job's like, no, that's not what's going on, and God steps in at the end, and it's all part of this conversation. These are two creatures that are it's really fascinating. Beautiful, powerful, awesome. They're not really safe. They're not simple. They're not cuddly creatures. They're dangerous, and it's a sign that there's disorder and there's risk in this good world that God has created. Why does God allow suffering? Your call is very important to us. There is more to this world than meets the eye. That's one of the things that comes as an answer, sort of through the dialogue with his friends, and then from God himself saying, do you understand have you even counted all these stars, right? We're still actually doing that. There's a lot of complexity. I love this passage in the 9th chapter when Job is speaking, and I think there is really fascinating. I didn't ever know this before about Job, and just when I was listening and reading the text, finding this passage, if only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together so that God's terror would frighten me no more, then I would speak without fear. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. And there's a couple parts of fear. There still is the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom that Proverbs teaches us, right? But there's actually real fear in the suffering and devastation and sickness and loss of life that happens in this story. So there's a couple different parts in this, Job's use of the word fear. But there's this little pointer to Christ that's in here. And I don't know if the writers had some inkling of that, or if this was just the way the words were expressed. It's beautiful. So some suggestions, if you haven't already, I know some of you have been reading Job or listening to Job. I strongly recommend on the Bible app that I use, you can switch to different translations, and the voice that comes with the message is actually really helpful. The other translations are good too, but I really like the reader of the message version, and it takes like a little bit less than a couple hours. Read through Job a few times. You might not want to do this back to back with the rest of your Sunday, but it takes a couple hours, and there's new things that you see every time you do it, listening or reading through it. Journal on some of those questions, and we're going to do a little bit of that today. Question theology that's a little too safe and too easy, and that's some of the things that becomes apparent that some of Job's friends, that's what they're doing. It's not like they're not trying hard or they don't have good minds, but they're bringing all these preconceived ideas that they have developed carefully and saying, here's what must be going on, Job. And Job and God seem to say, that's actually not the full story. Love those around us who do suffer. That's something we can do no matter what and where we are with these kinds of questions. Be a friend, listen and wrestle with our friends, and be honest with God. There's actually no risk in that other than we might get some hard questions back from God. And ambiguity versus certainty, theological tendencies of human beings, I think, tend to go towards, we want certainty, we want answers, we want conclusions. And a lot of times, theology, as we go through our lives, we might find that we understand some things better, but we won't necessarily reach certainty, right? So we're going to take a couple minutes, and if you could just, anything you can write on, if you want to write, just journal a few thoughts, write a few sentences that are questions you have, conclusions, ideas, new things that seem to come out of this story that we've encountered. And then just be ready to share a sentence or two after a couple minutes. I'm going to play a little bit of music. Any of you are ready to share sort of in one sentence formats, a question, a thought, a prayer, an idea, just go ahead and do that anytime.
there's one part in Job where there's an affiliation between illness and sin. And there's still some people today who still feel that there is an affiliation between illness and sin. Dora Sadiqo was a member of this church, a close friend of mine. And when she was very small, her folks immigrated to Mexico. But they still hung on to the very orthodox Mexican Catholic religion. And every time Dora had a cold or an illness, they sent her to confession because she had to relieve her sin in order to get well. And of course, she did get well. Of course, that was from the fruit that was against sin. So Dora eventually, when she became age, got tired of all that and became a Protestant.
Yeah. So tying illness with sin is actually the other side of the coin of the prosperity gospel, that people prosper because they somehow deserve it. God's saying, good for you, I'm going to give you this stuff. And neither of those is actually probably leads us towards the truth. Anything else? Questions, prayers, little ideas?
I'm just wondering if self-awareness helps some people that seem to have had addiction problems or depression problems for so long, and it just seems like at some point the people that succeed, a switch gets turned on in them. And is that a part where God has shown them a way to get out of this?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of examples of people I know. This is wonderful.
Yeah. Carter?
You had a couple questions on there in the slide previous. I thought were interesting. Something about easy and safe theology, how it's important to question, maybe be critical of that. And the next part is loving friends that are suffering. I think those might go hand in hand quite a bit. Because you notice that the friends never question their theology, but they're also not suffering. They're refusing to look at it from, they're only looking at it from the perspective of those who win, not those who don't have anything. So
Yeah.
I think trying to honor our perspectives from, we consider ourselves in a place of privilege, to use a more modern word, to look at it from a different perspective that will inherently, I think, reshape a lot of interesting things in our theology, what we do in life.
Yeah.
Well, also, kind of going off of that, I feel like the fact that the story starts out with this challenger, the Satan, who's questioning and challenging God, and I don't know, I feel like that kind of, it comes up over and over again, but it's also God created this being to question and challenge him.
Yeah. How do we channel that good action without becoming the accuser and questioner? Yeah.
It seems like we're always driven to ask why questions, and the book of Job seems to suggest that when we ask why, we're asking the wrong question. Which is hard because you want to have the answer.
Last one, Elise, and then we'll...
Well, I think, when you're in the midst of something like that, that is super hard and kind of unable to understand, and this was my experience, I, for the longest time, couldn't get over the sense of being abandoned. And I don't know that I ever fully reconciled that. Granted, I ultimately got well, and I kind of today feel like it was a miracle and all of that, but when I think back to the stuff I went through, I still don't understand that sense of being abandoned. And that's really hard.
Yeah. Well, we will wrap up. I will leave a couple of these things on the screen, but I'll let Andrea close us and finish up.
Thank you very much. Pray with me. God, thanks for the word written, heard, discovered again today. I pray that you would help us to ask good questions, ask questions that challenge and that lead, and that help us to trust in your wisdom, to know that wisdom, or to at least be open to it being beyond what we can know. God go with us this week and help us to see you in that. In your name we pray. Amen. So join us next week for Habakkuk. Is that you?
That is true.
Okay,
And the
Scott.
bad news is Job to be continued.
The suffering will not end. So please return next week for more. Thank you, Scott. And thank you all. Have a good one.
Of course.